Eli Whitney and the cotton version, that didn't make sense. Eli Whitney and the Cotton Gin, my version of the story. So, a long, long time ago, I've actually no idea when, there was this guy named Eli Whitney, and he was brilliant. He was one of the smartest men I know of, and I say this without having given you a definition of what I think is smart. So let me state that my operational definition of smart is someone who does something intellectual that revolutionizes the world in some way. That's what I'm using as my top tier of smartness. Eli Whitney, way back when, saw there were slaves. Remember that? Now we're talking before cotton was that profitable for plantation owners. It was kind of actually killing slavery. Slavery was not worthwhile in the United States way back when. It was slowly dying off, and the reason was having a slave required a lot of money. You had to give them a place to stay, you had to feed them, you didn't have to give them money or anything, but if you're a parent or a child, you should know that you spend a lot of money on your child or yourself if you're the child, that your parents spend that money on. Okay. Yeah, so same for slaves. They're not cheap. You know, you have to be making a huge return on investment to pay for the fact that you had to house them and feed them, and if they got sick, you might have to give them medicine because, I mean, some slave owners would be like, oh, you're going to die. But I bet there were some who paid for medicine. Maybe, hopefully, I hope. Slavery's kind of icky. So, what happened was, slavery's dying out, and Eli Whitney comes along. I'm not sure whether this is before or after he invented mass production. I'll talk about that in a minute. And he says, wait a second, I can nick slavery in the butt. I can just get rid of it. Just zap. Done. Forever. And he says, what I do is I invent something that makes slaves so much more efficient that you only need 1 or 2 of them to do the work of 20 of them. He didn't really think this fully through, I don't think. So he invents this thing called the cotton gin. And what the cotton gin does, if you've ever heard about it, is it separates cotton, like many other plants, has seeds. And then it has cotton. And the seeds are in the cotton. And in order to use the cotton, you have to pull out the seeds. And it used to be, they'd pick at it, and they'd pick, and they'd pick, and they'd have to pick all the seeds out. That was another reason, by the way. They couldn't use older slaves as much because they'd be really slow at picking these tiny little seeds. So there was a limited lifespan for how efficient a slave could be and for how long. Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. And suddenly, 1 slave can do the work of 40 slaves in 1/8 of the time. Those were completely made up statistics. I apologize for that. This whole thing is just me ranting about Eli Whitney, so if you need an apology for that, I don't understand you. Anyway, so he thinks to himself, I have officially killed slavery. It's not going to be necessary anymore. Who needs slaves when it's super efficient? What he didn't realize was there was this version of cotton, and it wasn't Indian cotton, because Indian cotton is more fine, you pull the seeds out or something like that. It was a version that grew in the South very well, but was super inefficient to plant because it had lots of seeds and they were really hard to get out. Suddenly, that type of cotton was much easier to produce, much cheaper. And that is why we had the cotton boom, where cotton pretty much became gold in terms of what it was worth, just worth up the wall. Suddenly they could produce lots of it for cheap, and slavery bubbled and got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And that is how Eli Whitney kind of reintroduced slavery as a strong foundation of the South. And you might think right now, wow, he's pretty much one of the reasons for the American Revolution, not the American Revolution, the American Civil War going so crazy. But I like to think about him as a brilliant man whose idea went a little bit off kilter. So, before we give up on this guy and say, wow, you're the reason that millions of slaves died, let's talk about something else he did. Because, as I said, I think this man is one of the smartest in history, just from my perspective, because he has more of an impact on my modern-day society in America than most others. The other thing he did was he invented mass production. You think, how does someone invent mass production? Well, a long time ago, on the battlefield, every gun was custom made. So you have the different parts. I've never actually held a gun, but you have, in a rifle, you have the long barrel, you have the handle, you have bullets, you have all this stuff, and it all needs to fit together. So it used to be every gun was completely unique. If you had a little clip on this one, and you needed the same clip on the other one, you couldn't transfer it. No. And it made it very difficult, because the weapons had to constantly, if they got broken at all, be brought to a mason. I think that's what they're called, the guys with the forges and the other things. That's a ball. That would happen. So, Eli Whitney, I think it was during the Civil War also, or the War of 1812, or another war. There's lots of wars in American history. There's also lots of wars in all history, so I'm not being so country-centric right now. It's just wars. They're wonderful. Not actually. I don't know. It depends on what they're for, and if they accomplish their goals, and how many people died. I don't know. I'm very much into evaluating all the stats. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about Eli Whitney. So, he goes to the government and he says, I can make it so that all of your guns, all the pieces, are interchangeable. And they look at him, think, kidding. It's like, I can do it. He sells them this idea. So the war happens, and I think maybe it was the War of 1812. You can look this up. You can correct me on all of this. I bet this whole story is just a made-up figment of my imagination. But if it's not, you might have learned something by the time it's over. So I'll keep going. He goes there. The war starts. He's like, I'll get it done in 2-3 years. No biggie. War starts. 3-4 years later, war ends. So it probably wasn't the Civil War. Maybe it was the end of the Civil War. Maybe it was the War of 1812. Maybe it was the War of Galactica with Star Wars. I think I just mixed sci-fi references and people are going to kill me now. But, so, war ends. But he is not done. He keeps working for, I think, 10 years on this project. 10 years later, he brings it back to the government and says, look at what you funded. I know, like, the war ended, 6-7 years ago. No biggie. Let me show you guys. So he says, guys, take any barrel you want, any handle you want, any bullet you want, and just assemble it. So these men say, okay, I'm going to take the barrel all the way on the right, and the center handle, and this and that and that. And they assemble their guns, and they all shoot them. And they all work. Now, in today's modern society, I think, of course they all work. All the parts were made so precisely that they all fit together. That's obvious. That's modern mass production. This was the first time mass production really had ever been used for anything complex. Maybe there's simpler examples that I don't know about, but this was the first time a man created something complex like a gun, a piece of tooling, machinery, whatever. I don't think you'd consider a gun a machine. A killing machine, I guess you could. That's a ball again. And made it so that all the parts were so precisely made that they were interchangeable. And that is why we have, not necessarily why, maybe someone else would have invented it if he hadn't, but that is one of the reasons he is majorly responsible. I would call him the father figure of modern mass production, and, oopsies, also possibly the reason slavery lasted as long as it did, and was so profitable, and caused the Civil War. So that's Eli Whitney in a nutshell, and I hope you learned something. And if you didn't, that's okay, because I was probably wrong in half my facts anyway. Actually, I hope I wasn't, because I like Eli Whitney. This is also a ball. Aren't you amused? I'm amused. Watch it. Have a wonderful afternoon.